Shabbat Shalom, everyone, again. Shabbat Shalom. A question for the room. Has anyone ever been in a situation where you're overwhelmed with some emotion, you're trying to get work done, you're just overwhelmed, and you're like, okay, you know what, I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes and just be sad for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to come back to work. Anyone ever done that? Yeah. Anyone ever done that with a dance party? Like, I'm overwhelmed, I have to get some emotion out, I'm just going to have a dance party for 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. And, can we just hear I just want to hear from a couple of people, does that work for you? Why does it work? If someone can say who. No, it doesn't. Okay, wait, Max, why does it? It doesn't work for you. Can you say why?
I'm just intrinsically always anxious about everything. Even when I try to give myself time,
you can't contain it.
Softens it a little bit.
Yeah.
Not fully.
The container is not. Okay. Anyone else it doesn't work for?
I've heard about people putting crying on their Google Calendar.
Putting crying on the Google Calendar. That's amazing. Yeah. How about someone who it does work for? Why does it work? Yeah, Katie.
I don't like dancing, but if you're having a really bad day, screaming to music in your car is really good for the soul.
Totally. Anyone else? One more for why it works? Yeah.
Like endorphins.
Endorphins, nice. Yeah. Good. Clearly different experiences with this in the room. We have no container, endorphins. I want to bring in, I was lucky this semester to have a lot of time studying a famous Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, really amazing, popular teachings. And a lot of his teachings emphasize this practice of sort of containing an emotion, controversial teaching, but he talks about the practice of hibodedut, or shouting out to God, and the way that he says to do that is to set a fixed time and to pour out your heart to God in despair, in anguish, in rage, and then outside of that set time to try to feel joy. Now, it's a controversial teaching of his, of course, in a lot of ways. How can you force yourself to feel an emotion for a certain amount of time? How can you force yourself to feel joy? Is that possible? Does it work? Even if it does, is it good? I certainly have different feelings about that at different moments, honestly, but actually our tradition in a lot of ways does encourage this to some extent. You can think about, it's a mitzvah to be happy on Purim, right? It's a mitzvah, Jewish law. It's a mitzvah to feel an emotion. Or similarly, not exactly the same, but it's a mitzvah to bring happiness and joy to a couple at their wedding, to make them happy. Our tradition really does create many containers like this for emotion. After the death of a loved one, we have containers of set time, right? We have a period of 7 days of Shiva for more intense sadness, then a period of Shloshim, 30 days, where we have a different tenor of that sadness. And then we have the period of saying Mourner's Kaddish each day for a full year. Until then, we just get to saying it once a year. So I've found pastorally that sometimes, as we've sort of heard in this room, sometimes these containers that our tradition creates for our emotion can make us go, okay, but it's Purim and I'm not feeling happy, so what? I'm not going to force myself to feel happy on Purim. And sometimes they can be helpful. They can sort of create some structure, some order, something useful around emotion. And something that Judaism also does is it creates containers not just for us as individuals, but it actually creates communal cycles of emotion. Meaning a container of emotion that's not just for one person, but for the whole Jewish people. All of us, as a whole, around our Hebrew calendar, around our Jewish year cycle. So as I talked about earlier in the service, again, today is the first Shabbat within this 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av. Again, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. And it's within these 3 weeks that we start this important part of the year, where again, we have 10 weeks, this emotional arc that leads to the end of the Jewish year and to the start of the new one, Rosh Hashanah. And we experience that cycle communally. So this 3-week period begins on the 17th of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, which was yesterday. We're going into the 19th tonight. And it marks that day, the 17th, marks the day when the walls of Jerusalem were invaded by the Romans in 69 CE. And it's this 3-week period of deep sadness and mourning that climaxes really and concludes with Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the date when both the first and second temples were destroyed, and which in modern times many other disasters and catastrophes of our people are associated with that date too. Expulsion from Spain, expulsion from England, murders in the Holocaust, they all get associated with this date, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's the saddest day of our calendar. So these 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is in a little less than 3 weeks from right now, and the following 7 weeks, so 10 weeks total, as we've said, are highlighted in our services in different ways, including by the Haftorah portion that we read. So normally in the year cycle, our Haftorah portions have something to do with the Torah portion that we're reading at that time. But in this part of the summer, starting with these 3 weeks, for 10 weeks, we read Haftorah portions that have to do with our collective experience as a Jewish people at this time throughout history. So we start tomorrow with the 3 Haftorot of destruction, which come from the books of Jeremiah and Isaiah and are full of doom and disappointment. We read those 3, then we reach Tisha B'Av, the saddest day. And then the first Shabbat after Tisha B'Av is what I sometimes like to think of as like a hug from our tradition. It's called Shabbat Nachamu, or Shabbat of consolation or comfort. And Shabbat Nachamu gets its name, of course, from the Haftorah portion that's read that day from the book of Isaiah, which begins, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, comfort my people. And this Haftorah portion is the first of the next group of Haftorot from this emotional arc for the next 7 weeks. The next 7 Haftorot are the Haftorot of consolation. And they're all from the book of Isaiah, all with messages of hope, comfort, and closeness to God. And then, once we've reached the end of those, then anyone know where we are in the year if you're following my... Rosh Hashanah. Then we're at the end of the year. So we have these 3 weeks of deep despair, these 7 weeks of comfort, a hug from our tradition, and then we're at the end of the Jewish year, the start of a new year, and of course, the whole emotional arc continues with the theme of teshuvah, forgiveness, return, and newness. So that means that right now we're at the very, very beginning of this long, intentional, emotional arc on the level of our entire people that leads to the end of the year. So just want everyone to take a minute and just take that in. Some questions about that. What does it mean to you? You can think about it. What does it mean to be in a container of emotion in general? What does it mean to be in a collective container of emotion in general? What does it mean to be in a collective container of emotion where that collective is the Jewish people? What does that mean? And what happens for you if your individual emotional experience doesn't match with what's happening in the year cycle? What does that mean? What if it does match? What does that mean? I like to see this collective container of time as an invitation into the cycle for each of us, with a stress really on what it means to be together and what that can do for our individual emotions too. And I want to bring us now looking ahead to that saddest day of our calendar, Tisha B'Av. So on Tisha B'Av, we do a public communal reading of the Book of Lamentations, which is a collection of lyrical laments that describe the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. And the laments, the verses are at times actually quite horrific, graphic, and they're overflowing with emotion, tragedy, rage, shock, brokenness. And the title in Hebrew for this book, with all of that, is just one word. It's a desperate question, eicha, literally, how? Or how could this have happened? Sometimes we know that in grief and pain and shock, that's actually the truest thing we could say. How? And on Tisha B'Av, we say it publicly, we say it communally, we say it together. Now, the book of Eicha contains 5 chapters, the first 4 describing the tragedy and destruction, and the 5th offering a process for commemorating it. The first 4 chapters, something really interesting about them, is that they're all written as an alphabetic acrostic. You can take a look at them if you haven't noticed that. The first verse starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. The second verse starts with Bet, etc. And in the third chapter, that pattern's emphasized. The first 3 verses start with Aleph, the second 3 start with Bet and Gimel. You can take a look. It's interesting to see. So a lot of people ask, well, what could it mean to have these laments written in the form of an alphabetic acrostic? What does that mean? So it's a somewhat common form used in Hebrew liturgy and poetry, right? This isn't the only place that we see it, of course. And it has various forms of meaning when it appears. A few different. For example, it could emphasize a concept of shleimut, or wholeness, like from A to Z. Covers the whole thing. Everything's captured in these verses. For example, our Ashrei prayer, you can take a look at it, is written as an alphabetic acrostic. And there it seems to emphasize a concept of shleimut, of wholeness, the wholeness of Hashem, the wholeness of our praise to Hashem forever and ever. An alphabetic acrostic is also often used in our tradition, actually just practically, to help with memorization, to help with saying liturgy, poems, verses by heart. Here in Eicha, I think there may be something else going on too, and it might be something about containers of time. I was learning about this in a class last year, actually, in Jerusalem, in a very complicated situation, and it was very interesting to learn about this in that context too. So in the midst of this period of 10 weeks of this emotional arc that we've been talking about, we also seem to have a container of time within our texts. If you think about it, when you're reciting the alphabet, you know where you are in it, right? You know. You know how close you are to the beginning. You know how close you are to the end. Maybe Eicha's structure is working as a pastoral tool to put some order and structure to our completely overwhelming pain. Some container of time. Maybe it tells us this pain is inside of a container, and it's inside of a container that does have an end. The verses of Eicha in their content are desperate, soul-searching, horrific, disastrous, and totally overwhelming. But its form is contained. First verse, Aleph. Second verse, Bet. Third verse, Gimel. There are a few letters that are switched around, if you look at it. That happens with most acrostics, but mostly it's a set and ordered container, and it has an end. So as we think about containers of time today, containers of emotion and what they do for us or don't do for us, I just want to invite us all into something together, which is that with the safety and surety of knowing that everything, not just pain, but everything is temporary, that we're in the midst of a cycle, that we have 3 weeks of sadness and then 7 weeks of comfort, that in 10 minutes the timer will go off, that leaning into the sadness can be over. Knowing with that surety, I invite us into, at this start of the 3 weeks, I invite us into the risk of leaning into it, to feeling the emotion, to feeling that melody for Lecha Dodi, but to doing it together, to crying out on an individual level, on a communal level as Jews, on a national level. Leaning into grief is an important part of the emotional arc. And our calendar, again, with the safety of the container and the edges which contain it, I think allows us to do that. Shabbat Shalom.